The candles had already been lit when Cecily entered the dining room, 37 of them arranged along the center of the table in their silver holders, their flames bending gently toward the draft from the hall. She counted them, because counting was a thing she did when her hands wanted to tremble, and she would not let them. 37 candles, 12 place settings, though only 5 of them would be occupied tonight. The rest were laid because Mrs. Fell had been instructed by Lady Georgiana to set the table for a formal supper, and Mrs. Fell, who had served the Drummond household for 19 years, did not argue with Lady Georgiana about place settings. Cecily had been the Duchess of Whitmore for 11 days. She had arrived at Whitmore House on the 12th of April with one trunk, a writing case, and a letter from her father that she had not yet opened because she already knew what it would say. Something about gratitude, something about providence, something about the unspeakable relief of having one fewer daughter to feed. Robert Leonard had 7 children and the income of a country rector, and when the Duke of Whitmore's solicitor had appeared in his parlor offering terms for Cecily's hand, her father had wept, not from sentiment, but from the sheer mathematics of it. 1 daughter settled, 6 remaining, the arithmetic of survival. The Duke himself had not proposed, he had not visited. He had sent his solicitor with a document, and Cecily had read it in her bedroom, with the door closed and the window open, because the room smelled of tallow and boiled mutton, and she had wanted to think clearly. The document was precise. She would receive an allowance. She would reside at Whitmore House. She would be Duchess in name and in law. The word love did not appear anywhere in its 14 pages, and she had not expected it to. They had married in London, at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a Tuesday morning in early April. The Duke had been correct in his dress, dark blue coat, white cravat, buff waistcoat, and correct in his manner. He had spoken the vows clearly. He had signed the register with a hand that did not hesitate, and when the service was concluded, he had offered her his arm and walked her to the carriage and said precisely 4 words to her before they reached Whitmore House. The roads are improved. She had agreed that they were. Now she stood at the entrance to the dining room and looked at the table with its 37 candles and its 12 place settings, and she smoothed the front of her muslin gown, cream, high-waisted, with a narrow band of lace at the neckline that her mother had added the week before the wedding, because it was the only new lace in the house, and she waited for someone to tell her where to sit. Lady Georgiana told her, "Do not let her sit with us." The words came from the far end of the table, where Georgiana was already seated in the chair to the right of the head. She was speaking to Breck, the steward, who had just pulled out the chair to the Duke's left, the Duchess's chair, the one that had belonged to Alistair's mother before her death and to no one in the years since. Georgiana's voice was not raised. She did not need to raise it. She had the particular clarity of a woman who had never once been told she was wrong. "She may take the side table if she wishes," Georgiana continued, adjusting the position of her wineglass by a 1/4 inch. "Or she may eat in her rooms. I have no objection to either." Breck's hand remained on the back of the chair. He did not move it. He did not release it. His eyes went to the doorway where Cecily stood, and then to the place setting in front of the chair, and then to the candles, as though the candles might offer guidance. Cecily did not move. She had learned the trick of not moving in the rectory, where 7 children competed for every scrap of space and sound, and the one who held still was often the one who was forgotten, which was, in the Leonard household, the safest thing to be. She held still now. Her hands did not tremble. Her expression did not change. She stood in the doorway in her cream muslin dress, and she looked at the dining table as though it were a landscape she was studying from a distance, interesting, but not urgent. "Georgiana," Alistair's voice came from behind Cecily. She had not heard him approach. He moved quietly for a man of his height, tall, dark-haired, built with the kind of restrained solidity that suggested he had once been active and had since become merely contained. He was still in the coat he had worn to ride out that morning, though he had changed his boots. He stepped past Cecily without touching her, without looking at her, and walked the length of the dining room toward the table. "She may sit where she likes," Georgiana said, as though amending her earlier statement were a concession. "I heard what you meant." He reached the chair. Breck stepped back. Alistair placed both hands on the back of the chair. Dark oak, carved with wheat sheaves, older than anyone living in the house, and he lifted it. Not dragged. Lifted. The legs cleared the floor by 2 inches, and the chair made no sound as he carried it around the end of the table, past the empty place settings with their untouched silver, past the candelabra at the center that threw his shadow long and steady across the wall. The dining room was silent except for the faint settling of the fire in the hearth and the whisper of his boots on the carpet. He carried the chair the way a man carries something that matters to him, not with effort, but with intention. He set it down to his left at the head of the table, in the place where no setting had been laid because the Duchess's place was already set 3 seats away, in the position of a wife, not beside him, not at the head, but near enough to be present and far enough to be reminded of her rank within this household as Georgiana understood it. He pulled the chair back. He looked at Cecily for the first time since entering the room. He said nothing. He did not need to. The chair, the silence, the steadiness of his hands, these were the vocabulary of a man who had never learned to say what he meant and had therefore learned to show it. Cecily walked the length of the dining room. She was aware of Georgiana's silence, which was different from her own. Georgiana's silence was the silence of a woman recalculating, and Cecily's silence was the silence of a woman who had already calculated and was simply waiting for the numbers to be confirmed. She reached the chair. She sat down. She placed her hands in her lap and looked at the table and waited for supper to be served. Alistair sat at the head. He unfolded his napkin. He nodded to Breck, who signaled Mrs. Fell, who signaled the kitchen. Georgiana ate very little that evening. The household had taken its measure of Cecily within her first week, though the household's measure and Georgiana's measure were 2 different instruments. Mrs. Fell had understood the situation on the second morning, when she had gone to the Duchess's rooms to introduce herself and had found Cecily already dressed, already at her writing desk, composing a letter to her mother with instructions about the younger children's schooling. The ink was good. The hand was steady. The letter contained 3 specific questions about arithmetic instruction and one about the cost of a Latin tutor in Hertfordshire, and Mrs. Fell had recognized immediately that this was not a woman who had married a duke for the pleasure of being idle. "Your Grace," Mrs. Fell had said, "shall I show you the house this morning?" "Please," Cecily had replied, and she had spent the next 4 hours walking every corridor, every staircase, every pantry and still room and linen cupboard in Whitmore House. She had asked questions that Mrs. Fell did not expect, not about the silver or the portraits, but about the coal delivery schedule and the state of the roof above the east wing and whether the kitchen garden produced enough to reduce the greengrocer's bill. By noon, Mrs. Fell had revised her opinion of the Duchess from tolerable to formidable, and had begun, without instruction, to direct the junior staff to address their questions to Her Grace rather than to Lady Georgiana. Georgiana had noticed this within 2 days. She had noticed it the way a woman notices a draft, not all at once, but through accumulating discomforts. A maid who curtsied to Cecily first, a footman who waited for the Duchess's nod before clearing, the greengrocer's boy asking Mrs. Fell whether Her Grace wanted the same order as last week, meaning Cecily, not meaning Georgiana, who had been Her Grace in practice if not in title for 5 years since their mother's death. Georgiana was not cruel. This was important to understand because the easy reading of her was cruelty, and the easy reading was wrong. Georgiana was afraid. She had been the woman of Whitmore House since she was 22. She had managed the accounts, overseen the tenants' welfare through Breck, hosted the dinners, chosen the menus, arranged the flowers, and maintained the social position of the Drummond family through 2 difficult seasons, when Alistair had retreated from society after their mother's death and refused every invitation that came to the house. Georgiana had held it all together. She had done it well. And now, a rector's daughter from Hertfordshire was sitting in her mother's chair and the staff were already turning. The chair at dinner was not a beginning. It was a culmination. The days after the dinner were quiet, in the way that a held breath is quiet, full of pressure, waiting for release. Cecily did not mention the chair. She did not mention Georgiana's words. She rose each morning, dressed in one of her 3 good gowns, the cream muslin, a pale blue silk that had been her mother's, and a gray cotton that she wore when walking the grounds, and she attended to the household through Mrs. Fell with the careful attention of a woman who understood that her position was legal, but her authority was earned. Alistair was absent most days. He rode out early, attended to the estate with Breck, took his meals in his study, and appeared at dinner with the punctuality of a man who believed that domestic obligation could be discharged through physical presence alone. He sat at the head of the table. Cecily sat to his left. Georgiana sat to his right. They ate in a silence that was not hostile but was not warm, the kind of silence that fills a room where three people are each thinking something they will not say. He spoke to Cecily occasionally, brief exchanges, the quality of the lamb, whether she had walked that day. Once, on the 5th evening after the chair, he asked her whether she had written to her family, and she said that she had, and he nodded, and that was the whole of it. But Cecily noticed things. She noticed that when Breck brought the monthly accounts, Alistair reviewed them in his study for exactly 40 minutes and then sent them to Mrs. Fell with a note that said only, "Proceed as you see fit," which meant that the real decisions about the household were being made by Mrs. Fell, which meant that they were increasingly being shaped by Cecily, which meant that the rector's daughter from Hertfordshire was, week by week, becoming the operational center of Whitmore House without anyone having formally appointed her to anything. She noticed, too, that Alistair watched her, not often, not openly, but she would look up from her plate and find his gaze already there, resting on her the way light rests on a surface, present but not pressing. He watched the way she held her fork, the way she listened when Mrs. Fell described a problem with the linen supplier, the way she did not flinch when Georgiana made small cutting remarks about country habits or simple tastes. He watched, and he said nothing, and Cecily understood that she was being assessed by a man who did not yet know what he was assessing her for. 3 weeks after the chair, the Countess of Harwell came to call. Lady Harwell was Georgiana's closest friend and the most prolific gossip in the county. She arrived in a green pelisse and a bonnet trimmed with silk flowers that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, and she sat in the drawing-room and accepted tea from the footman and looked at Cecily with the frank appraisal of a woman who had already formed her opinion and was simply collecting evidence to support it. "You must find Whitmore House very grand," Lady Harwell said, after a rectory. "I find it very well maintained," Cecily replied. "Mrs. Fell is exceptional. Georgiana has always run a fine house." "She has," Cecily agreed. "I have told her so." This was true. Cecily had, on the 2nd week, sought Georgiana in the morning room and thanked her directly for the condition in which she had maintained the house. The compliment had been genuine and delivered without hesitation, and Georgiana had received it the way one receives a gift one suspects of concealing a mechanism, turning it over, looking for the catch, finding none, and setting it aside without trusting it. Lady Harwell stayed for an hour. She asked Cecily about her family, her education, her accomplishments. Cecily answered every question truthfully and without elaboration. She played no instrument. She drew nothing of merit. She spoke French competently and could read Latin because her father had taught all 7 children regardless of sex. She had managed a household of 9 on an income that would not cover Whitmore House's candle bill for a quarter. "How charming," Lady Harwell said, in a voice that meant the opposite. Cecily poured her another cup of tea and said nothing, and Lady Harwell left, and Cecily sat in the drawing-room alone for several minutes afterward, looking at the fire in the hearth, her hands perfectly still in her lap. The following Sunday, Alistair mentioned at dinner that he would be required in London for the sitting of the House of Lords. A question of land enclosure had been brought before the Lords by the Duke of Rutland, and Alistair's attendance was expected. He would leave on Tuesday and return by Friday. He said this to the table generally, addressing neither his wife nor his sister specifically, and then he returned to his soup. "Shall I write to Lady Harwell about the supper on Thursday?" Georgiana asked. "She will want to know the arrangements." "What supper?" Alistair said. "The supper I have planned for Thursday evening. 8 guests, the Harwells, the Penroses, Sir William Drake, and his daughter." There was a pause. Cecily continued eating. She had not been informed of any supper. "You will act as hostess?" Alistair asked Georgiana. "I always have." Another pause. Alistair looked at Cecily. She looked back at him. Her expression gave him nothing, no expectation, no resentment, no appeal. She simply looked at him the way she always looked at him, with the level patience of a woman who had decided that her dignity was not a thing she would entrust to anyone else's decisions. "The Duchess will act as hostess," Alistair said. "It is her house." He returned to his soup. Georgiana's spoon did not move for the rest of the course. The supper on Thursday was Cecily's first test as hostess, and she conducted it with the precision of a woman who had been managing meals for a family of 9 since she was 14. She consulted with Mrs. Fell about the menu: roast duck, a white soup, asparagus from the kitchen garden, syllabub for dessert, and Mrs. Fell had nodded at each selection with the quiet approval of a woman who recognized competence when she encountered it. She reviewed the seating with Breck, placing Lady Harwell far enough from the head of the table that the positioning would be noticed, and close enough that it could not be called an insult. She chose flowers from the garden herself, early roses, not fully open, arranged simply in low vessels so that conversation could pass unobstructed across the table. She spent 20 minutes in the kitchen with Mrs. Hatch, the cook, discussing the timing of the courses, and Mrs. Hatch, who had prepared meals for Georgiana's suppers for 5 years and had never once been consulted about timing, had looked at Cecily with an expression that fell somewhere between surprise and devotion. She wore the pale blue silk, which was the finest thing she owned, and she stood before the mirror in her bedchamber and considered her reflection with the honest assessment of a woman who had never relied on beauty and did not intend to start. The gown was 4 years old. The color had faded slightly at the shoulders where it had hung near the window in the rectory, but it fitted well, and the empire waist gave it the silhouette of the period, and she pinned her hair up simply with 2 pins that had been her mother's, and she went downstairs and greeted each guest at the door with the composure of a woman who had been receiving company in her own house for years rather than days. Lady Harwell arrived and found Cecily at the door instead of Georgiana, and absorbed this information with the rapid internal adjustment of a woman who understood that the ground had shifted. "Your Grace," Lady Harwell said, and curtsied, and meant it differently than she had the week before. The supper was unremarkable in its content and extraordinary in its implication. Cecily sat at the head. She led the conversation when it faltered. She asked Sir William about the drainage improvements on his estate and listened to his answer with genuine interest, because drainage improvements were the kind of thing she actually understood. She complimented Mrs. Penrose's brooch without making Mrs. Penrose feel observed. She said little about herself and asked much about others, which is the surest method of being considered excellent company by people who prefer to talk about themselves. Georgiana sat at the middle of the table. She was polite. She contributed. But the axis of the room had shifted, and everyone at the table knew it, and Georgiana knew that they knew, and this knowledge settled over her like a fine cold ash. Alistair returned from London on Friday afternoon and found a house that had changed. He noticed it in small things, the new arrangement of the drawing room, which was somehow both simpler and warmer, the fresh flowers in the hall, which his mother had always insisted upon and which Georgiana had discontinued, the particular quality of the silence in the house, which was no longer the silence of a building waiting for someone to take charge of it, but the silence of a building that had been taken charge of and was at rest. He found Cecily in the library, reading. She was seated in the window, and the late afternoon light fell across the page of her book, and she looked up when he entered and said, "Good afternoon, Your Grace. The supper went well. Mrs. Fell has the accounts." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. The change came not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, a tide rather than a wave. Alistair began to appear at mealtimes more regularly. He began to ask Cecily questions that were not about the lamb or the weather, questions about her family, her childhood, her opinions on the management of the tenant cottages, which she delivered with a directness that he found, to his own surprise, refreshing rather than presumptuous. She did not soften her views for his comfort. When she disagreed with a decision he had made about the south pasture, she said so plainly, and then she explained why, and she was right, and he told Breck to adjust the arrangement the following morning. Georgiana watched this. She watched her brother lean forward when Cecily spoke. She watched him smile, once, briefly, at something Cecily said about the excessive formality of the dining room, and the smile undid something in Georgiana that she had been holding together with will and habit and the conviction that she was indispensable. She was not indispensable. This was the knowledge that arrived like a guest who would not leave. She had held the house for 5 years. She had done it out of love and out of duty and out of the private terror that if she stopped being useful, she would stop being necessary. And if she stopped being necessary, she would have to confront the fact that she was 27 years old and unmarried, and living in her brother's house with no establishment of her own and no prospect of one that did not depend on his generosity. Cecily understood this before Alistair did. Cecily understood it because she had grown up in a house where 7 children competed for resources that would never be sufficient, and she recognized the mathematics of Georgiana's fear, the desperate arithmetic of a woman calculating her own value in a household that no longer required her calculations. On a Tuesday evening in May, 5 weeks after the chair, Cecily went to Georgiana's sitting room. She knocked. She waited. She entered when Georgiana said, "Come," and she stood just inside the doorway, and she said, without preamble, "I will never ask you to leave this house. Whatever you believe of me, believe that." Georgiana was sitting at her writing desk. Her pen was in her hand. She did not put it down. "You are the Duchess," Georgiana said. "You may ask whatever you like." "I may, I will not. You are his sister, and this is your home, and I did not come here to displace you." "Then what did you come here to do?" Cecily considered the question. She had been asked it before, by her own mother, by Mrs. Fell, by herself in the privacy of her own rooms on the nights when the size of the house pressed against her like a physical weight. "To be adequate to it," she said, "nothing more than that." Georgiana looked at her for a long time, then she put down her pen. "The flowers in the hall," she said. "My mother always kept them there." "I know," Cecily said. "Mrs. Fell told me." Something passed across Georgiana's face, not warmth, not yet, but the first loosening of a thing held too tightly for too long. She nodded. Cecily left. Neither of them mentioned the conversation again, but the following morning Georgiana came to breakfast 10 minutes earlier than usual and sat in her usual chair and said, "The roses are opening beautifully this year." And Cecily agreed that they were, and Breck, who was pouring the coffee, glanced at Mrs. Fell in the doorway, and Mrs. Fell permitted herself the smallest inclination of her head, which was as close to triumph as she ever came. The ball at Harwell Court in late June was the first event that the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore attended together in society. Cecily wore a new gown, ivory silk, empire waist, a ribbon of gold at the hem that caught the candlelight when she moved, that Alistair had arranged through his London tailor without telling her, leaving it on her bed with no note because he was still a man who expressed himself through acts rather than words, and acts were what he had, and words were what he was learning. They entered the ballroom together. 200 candles in crystal chandeliers overhead, their light falling in warm cascades across polished floors, and the pale shoulders of women in silk and muslin. 80 guests. The musicians were playing something by Handel, steady and dignified, and the air smelled of beeswax and rosewater and the particular warmth of a room filled with bodies in their finest clothing. The ton had assembled in their summer finery, watching the doorway the way an audience watches a stage, because the Duke of Whitmore had married a nobody, and everyone wanted to see what a nobody looked like when she entered a room on the arm of one of the highest-ranking men in England. What she looked like was certain, not beautiful in the way the ton measured beauty, not porcelain, not delicate, not ornamental. Her face was too strong for porcelain, her shoulders too straight for delicacy, her gaze too steady for ornament. But certain. She held his arm without gripping it. She surveyed the room without scanning it. She moved through the crowd with the particular grace of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where she did not belong and had decided at some point that belonging was not a thing she required from a room. The ivory silk caught the candlelight as she walked, and the gold ribbon at the hem moved like a quiet declaration, and the 2 mother-of-pearl pins in her hair, she had replaced the plain ones with a pair Alistair had left on her dressing table the previous morning, again without note, caught the light and held it. Lady Harwell presented them. Guests approached, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease, because Cecily had a quality that put people at rest without them understanding how she did it. She received them with warmth that was genuine without being effusive, interest that was specific without being intrusive. She asked Sir William about the drainage improvements on his estate, and listened to his answer with the focus of a woman who had grown up hearing her father discuss field rotation, and knew that a man who improved his drainage was a man who cared about his tenants. She complimented Mrs. Penrose's brooch, a cameo, Georgian, handed down from her grandmother, without making Mrs. Penrose feel observed. She asked the younger Miss Drake about her watercolors and received a stammering answer with such kindness that Miss Drake later told her father she wished to call on the Duchess at Whitmore House. Sir William told his daughter that the Duchess of Whitmore was the most sensible woman he had spoken to all season. Georgiana was present. She wore deep blue, still beautiful, still sharp, still Georgiana. But she was standing at the edge of the room rather than the center of it, and when Lady Penrose approached her and said, "Your brother seems quite taken with his Duchess," Georgiana replied, "She is adequate to it," and the phrase had the quality of a thing being handed back to its rightful owner. Alistair danced with Cecily once. It was a country dance, not a waltz, and they moved through the figures with the coordinated precision of two people who had been living in the same house for 2 months and had absorbed each other's rhythms without either of them noticing the absorption. When the dance ended, he led her to the side of the room and brought her a glass of wine and stood beside her and said, in a voice that only she could hear, "I should have written to you before the wedding." "You sent your solicitor," she said. "The document was very thorough." "I should have written to you myself." She looked at him. The candlelight moved across his face. He was not handsome in the way of the young officers who lined the far wall. He was weathered and serious, and carried the particular weight of a man who had inherited a dukedom at 26 and a grief at 31, and had managed neither with the fluency he believed they required. "You are writing to me now," she said. He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted, a settling, a coming to rest, and he nodded, and they stood together at the edge of the ballroom and watched the dancing, and neither of them needed to say anything more, because the conversation they were having had never been conducted in words and did not require them now. That night, in the carriage home, Alistair sat across from Cecily and Georgiana, and the dark countryside moved past the windows, hedgerows and stone walls and the occasional flicker of a cottage candle in the distance, and nobody spoke. The horses' hooves were steady on the road, the carriage swayed gently. Cecily rested her head against the seat and closed her eyes, and Alistair watched her in the darkness, and Georgiana watched him watching. And the silence was, for the first time, comfortable, not the silence of 3 people avoiding speech, but the silence of 3 people who had said enough for one evening and were content to let the night carry them home. When they arrived at Whitmore House, Alistair handed Cecily down from the carriage. His hand held hers for a moment longer than the descent required. The entrance hall was lit with candles that Mrs. Fell had kept burning, and the flowers, fresh roses, white and pale pink, stood on the table where Alistair's mother had always placed them, and the house smelled of beeswax and warmth and the faint sweetness of the garden coming through the open windows. "Good night," Cecily said. "Good night," Alistair replied, and then, as she turned toward the stairs, "The gown suits you." She paused on the second step. She did not turn around, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, just enough. And she continued up the stairs, and Alistair stood in the entrance hall and listened to her footsteps until they faded. And then he stood there a moment longer, in the candlelight, in the silence, in the particular stillness of a man who was beginning to understand something he had not expected to understand. The years after settled over Whitmore House, the way light settles over a landscape in the late afternoon, gradually, warmly, without announcement. Cecily bore 2 children, a daughter first, Eleanor, who had her mother's steady gaze and her father's dark hair, and then a son, Thomas, who arrived 2 years later with a temperament so mild that Mrs. Fell declared him the easiest infant she had ever encountered in 19 years of service. The nursery that had been closed since Alistair and Georgiana's childhood was reopened and filled with the particular noise that children bring to a house that has been quiet for too long. The sound of small feet on old floors, of laughter carrying down staircases, of a child calling out in the night and being answered. Mrs. Fell presided over the household with the satisfied authority of a woman whose judgment had been vindicated. She had known, from the second morning, that Cecily Drummond was the right woman for this house, and she had been right, and being right was the thing that Mrs. Fell valued above all earthly comforts. Breck managed the estate under Cecily's quiet oversight, consulting her on tenant matters and maintenance schedules, with the deference of a man who had recognized where the real decisions were being made and had adjusted accordingly. The tenants prospered. The south pasture, adjusted per Cecily's suggestion, produced the best yield in the county 3 years running, and Alistair mentioned this at the House of Lords one afternoon to the Duke of Rutland, who asked how it had been achieved, and Alistair said, "My wife," and offered no further explanation. Georgiana remained at Whitmore House. She had her own rooms, her own schedule, her own circle of calls and correspondences. She did not manage the household. She did not need to. She had found, in the absence of responsibility, a freedom she had not expected, the freedom to read, to walk, to accept an invitation to visit cousins in Bath without worrying about the menus, the accounts, the linen supply. She taught Eleanor to play the pianoforte and discovered that she was a patient teacher, which surprised her more than it surprised anyone else. She was not displaced, she was released. This distinction took her some time to understand, and longer still to admit, but she understood it eventually, and the understanding changed the shape of her face, softened it, eased it, made her look, for the first time in years, like a woman who was not bracing for something. She and Cecily were never intimate. They did not become confidants. But they developed the particular rapport of two women who have measured each other accurately and found the measurement sufficient. They took tea together on Thursday afternoons in the drawing room, with its simple arrangement and its fresh flowers. They discussed the children. They disagreed about gardens. Georgiana preferred formal arrangements and Cecily preferred cottage abundance. And the disagreement was genuine and without malice. And the garden, in time, became half formal and half abundant, which pleased neither of them entirely, and both of them more than they admitted. Alistair, who had married a stranger because his solicitor had advised him that a wife was necessary and a rector's daughter was affordable, found himself, by degrees, married to a woman he could not imagine the house without. He did not say this. He was not a man who made declarations. But he showed it, in the way he entered a room and looked for her first, in the way he brought her books from London without being asked, in the way he carried Eleanor on his shoulders through the garden on summer evenings, while Cecily watched from the library window, with an expression that Mrs. Fell, passing in the corridor, once saw and never mentioned to anyone, because some things are too private even for a housekeeper who has seen everything. He showed it, too, in the way he stood behind her chair at dinner sometimes, and rested his hand on the back of it for a moment before sitting down, an echo of that first evening when he had lifted it and moved it and said nothing and meant everything. The chair remained at the head of the table, to his left. Mrs. Fell polished it herself every week. Nobody ever suggested moving it back. On a September evening, years later, Cecily sat in the library at Whitmore House with her daughter on one side and a stack of household accounts on the other, and the last of the day's light falling through the window onto her hands. Alistair was in London for the House of Lords. Georgiana was in Bath. The house was quiet and full at the same time, the particular fullness of a house that has been made into a home by someone who understood that homes are not given but built, not claimed but earned, one steady day at a time. She opened her father's letter, the one from the wedding, the one she had never read. She read it now. It said what she had expected: gratitude, providence, relief. But at the bottom, in her father's small, cramped hand, he had added a line she had not expected. "You have always been the strongest of my children, Cecily. I did not need to worry. I see that now." She folded the letter. She placed it inside the cover of the book she was reading. She looked at her daughter, who was drawing something on a scrap of paper, a house perhaps, or a horse, or the kind of thing that children draw when they are safe and warm and certain that the world they live in will be there in the morning. The candles burned steadily. The hearth was warm. The house held its breath around her, not in anticipation, but in the deep settled quiet of a place that has found its center and intends to keep it. They arrive here, like a chair moved across a room, without ceremony, without words, simply into the place where they were always meant to be.